What if the story we've been told was never the full story? For more than 2,000 years, one name has quietly shaped the way humans think about power, strategy, and survival: Sun Tzu. A figure wrapped in silence, a mind that changed the course of history, yet left almost no trace behind, no confirmed face, no certain grave, no complete record of his life, just a book, The Art of War. A text so precise, so timeless, that even today, it feels ahead of us. But here's what makes it strange: for someone whose ideas traveled across empires, man himself seems to vanish. Almost as if he was never meant to be found. For centuries, this mystery remained untouched. Historians debated, scholars argued. Some believed Sun Tzu was real, others believed he was a legend. A name created over time, a symbol rather than a person, and without evidence, truth stayed buried until the modern world introduced something ancient history never had: DNA, not stories. Not written records, but biology, something that doesn't rely on memory or belief, something that carries truth. Across generations, at first, no one connected this to Sun Tzu. There was no reason to. Scientists studying DNA weren't searching for ancient generals. They were mapping populations, tracing migrations, understanding how families across regions. But sometimes, when you look for one thing, you find something else, something unexpected, something that doesn't fit. And that's exactly what happened. Because hidden inside the genetic data of modern populations in China, researchers began to notice patterns, parts that shouldn't exist, men from different regions, different backgrounds, different family histories, yet they shared something identical: a specific genetic marker, passed from father to son, the Y chromosome. Unlike other DNA, this one barely changes over time. It moves through generations, almost untouched, like a signature, a biological echo of a single ancestor. And when multiple people share the same Y DNA pattern, this means one thing: they come from the same male lineage. At some point in the past, they all trace back to one man. At first, this wasn't unusual. Large populations often share common ancestors, but this case was different. Because the pattern wasn't random, it was concentrated, connected to families with the same surname: Sun. A name carried by millions today. But buried within historical records, some of these families claimed something extraordinary. They believed they were descendants of Sun Tzu. For centuries, these claims were dismissed. After all, many families throughout history claim famous ancestors. It brings honor, identity, legacy. But rarely is it provable until now, because for the first time, these claims could be tested. Not with documents, not with stories, but with DNA. And when scientists began comparing the Y chromosome data from different Sun family lines, they expected variation, differences, breaks in the lineage. But that's not what they found. Instead, they found consistency: multiple Sun families, spread across different regions, shared nearly identical Y DNA signatures, not just similar, almost exact. As if they all came from the same origin, the same man. And then came the question: when did this ancestor live? Because DNA doesn't just connect people, it can estimate time. Using mutation rates, scientists can trace how far back a lineage began. And when they calculated it, result was unsettling. The common ancestor lived around 2,500 years ago. Exactly when Sun Tzu was believed to exist. At first, it seemed almost too perfect, too aligned, too convenient. But science doesn't deal in coincidence, it deals in probability. And the probability of this alignment was extremely low, which meant this wasn't just a random ancestor. This was someone significant, someone whose lineage didn't just survive, spread. And that's where the mystery deepened, because historically, Sun Tzu was never described as a man with a powerful family. There were no records of a great dynasty, no mentions of a large bloodline. No empire built by his descendants, just silence. So how could his genetic signature be so widespread? How could a man who seemed to disappear from history leave behind a lineage so visible in DNA? It didn't make sense unless something was missing, something not written, or perhaps something deliberately hidden, because history is not always complete. It's shaped by what survives, and sometimes by what is erased. As researchers looked deeper, they began to notice something else, a pattern beyond genetics. Across different periods of Chinese history, individuals with the surname Sun appeared again and again, not always famous, not always recorded in detail, but often in positions of strategy. Military advisors, tacticians, thinkers, people who understood conflict differently. It wasn't obvious, not enough to stand out at first, but when viewed together, it formed a quiet thread, a presence. Subtle, but consistent, almost as if something was continuing generation after generation, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently, and that raises a question. What if Sun Tzu's legacy was never just his book? What if it was something else? Something passed down, not through texts, not through blood. Because when scholars revisited the art of war, they noticed something unusual. The writing, it felt unified, yet layered. Certain passages carried different tones, different rhythms, almost as if they were written at different times or by different hands. This idea isn't new. Some historians have long suspected that the art of war may not have been written by one person alone. But what if that idea goes deeper? What if the knowledge within it was refined over generations, passed from father to son, teacher to student, within the same lineage, a tradition, hidden inside a name? Because Sun Tzu doesn't simply mean a person, it can also mean Master Sun, a title, not just an identity. And if that's true, then the story changes completely. Because now, we're not looking for one man, we're looking for a line, a bloodline, a sequence of minds, connected not just by ideas, no, by DNA. And suddenly, genetic discovery makes more sense. Because it wouldn't represent one individual, but an entire lineage, a family, whose influence stretched quietly across centuries, and maybe never truly ended. But then, something even more unexpected appeared in the data, a detail, small at first, impossible to ignore. The Y DNA signature was slightly older than expected, not by much, but enough to raise questions, because if the ancestor lived just before Sun Tzu's time, then he couldn't be the origin. He would be part of something already existing. Which means Sun Tzu may not have been the beginning. He may have been a continuation, a descendant of an older line. And that changes everything, because now, question isn't just, did Sun Tzu have descendants? It becomes, what did he inherit? What knowledge, what training, what philosophy was passed to him before he ever wrote a single word? Because greatness rarely appears in isolation. It builds, it evolves, and sometimes it hides. As this possibility grew, so did the implications. Because if such a lineage existed, it wouldn't need recognition, it wouldn't need fame, it would operate differently, quickly, strategically, just as the art of war teaches win without being seen, influence without being noticed, control without revealing yourself. And suddenly, idea of a hidden bloodline didn't feel so impossible. It felt consistent with everything Sun Tzu represented. But the deeper scientists went, more complicated the picture became, because while the DNA connected these families, this didn't tell the full story. It couldn't confirm identity. It couldn't say, with certainty, this is Sun Tzu. It only pointed, suggested, implied, and in doing so, it opened a door into a past that may never have been fully recorded, because history remembers events. But DNA remembers people. And sometimes, two don't match, which leaves us here, standing between evidence and mystery, because now we know something. There was a man, too, 500 years ago, whose lineage spread across generations, a lineage still visible today, a lineage possibly connected to one of the greatest strategists in history, but we still don't know one thing. Was that man Sun Tzu? Or was Sun Tzu just one part of something much larger? Because if the bloodline came before him, then who started it, and why does it seem to follow the same pattern? Strategy, influence, presence, without visibility. It's almost as if philosophy of the art of war was never just written, it was lived, passed down, protected, and hidden. And if that's true, then the story we've been told is only the surface, because beneath it, there may be something else, something older, something deliberate. A lineage that understood one thing better than anyone else. The greatest power is the one no one sees, and just when it seemed like the mystery couldn't go deeper, research uncovered something unexpected. Something that didn't fit the timeline, didn't fit the narrative, didn't fit history at all. And that's the moment everything changed. Because the next discovery would challenge not just who Sun Tzu was and what he truly represented, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's where it truly began. Because once the first genetic patterns were identified, researchers didn't stop. They couldn't. The data raised more questions than answers, and in science, that's the most dangerous place to be. So they went further. More samples, more regions, more comparisons across generations. They expanded the data set, pulled records from distant provinces, tested families who had never been connected before. And slowly, the picture became clearer, but also more unsettling, because the deeper they looked, less simple the story became. At first, the assumption was straightforward: one man, one origin. One lineage spreading over time, but the numbers didn't fully support that. The Y chromosome marker, one shared across these Sun families, was not just widespread, it was structured, clustered in ways that suggested something intentional, something organized, not random expansion, not natural population growth alone. It looked guided, as if the lineage didn't just spread, it positioned itself, and that's when the timeline became critical. Because when scientists recalculated the age of the shared ancestor, with more refined data, they found something subtle, but significant. The origin point shifted slightly earlier. Just before the lifetime, traditionally associated with Sun Tzu, not centuries earlier, not dramatically different, but enough to change the interpretation completely. Because now, Sun Tzu could not be the starting point. He would be a continuation, a descendant of an already existing line, and that idea changed everything. Because if he inherited that lineage, then what else did he inherit? Knowledge, training, a philosophy that existed long before his name was ever written. Because suddenly, the art of war didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a refinement, a distillation of something older, something already developed and possibly protected. As historians revisited ancient records with this perspective, patterns began to emerge. Not obvious patterns, not something you would notice at first glance. But when viewed over long stretches of time, they became harder to ignore. Across different dynasties, different eras, different political systems, individuals with the surname Sun appeared. Not always in the spotlight, not always remembered in textbooks, but often close to power: advisors, strategists, military thinkers, people who influenced outcomes without being the visible leaders. And that's important, because the art of war itself emphasizes something very specific. The highest level of strategy is subtle, invisible, winning without being recognized, influencing without being seen. And if a lineage truly followed that philosophy, you wouldn't expect to see it clearly in history. You would expect exactly this: a quiet presence, consistent but seared, but never obvious. And that raises a question that's difficult to ignore. What if the greatest strategists in history weren't isolated individuals? What if they were part of something continuous? A lineage of thinking. A pattern passed through generations, refined over time, because knowledge can be written, but mastery is often taught privately, carefully, and sometimes only within a family. As this possibility grew, so did the implications, because if Sun Tzu inherited this knowledge, then his genius wasn't created in a moment. It was built layer by layer, gelidation by generation. And that would explain something that has puzzled scholars for centuries: how the art of war feels so complete, so advanced, so ahead of its time, because ideas like that don't usually appear fully formed. They evolve, unless they've been evolving long before they were ever written down, but the most unexpected detail came from a different angle entirely. Not history, not genetics, but probability. Because when scientists looked at how widely this Y-DNA marker had spread, they realized something unusual. The number of descendants was larger than expected, significantly larger, which suggested one of two things: either the lineage expanded extremely rapidly, or it held some form of social advantage. Something that allowed it to persist, to grow, to survive disruptions that erased others, wars, dynasty changes, population collapses. Through all of it, this genetic line continued. And not just survived, and remained relevant, which leads to an uncomfortable idea. What if the lineage didn't just adapt to history, understood it, anticipated it? Because strategy, at its core, is about seeing patterns before others do, and acting on them quickly, effectively. If a family line carried that mindset, generation after generation, it wouldn't need power in the traditional sense. It wouldn't need to rule. It would simply need to influence. And influence leaves very little trace, at least in written history, but not in DNA. DNA remembers everything, even when records don't, even when stories change, even when names disappear. And that's what makes this discovery so powerful, because for the first time, we're not relying only on texts. We're looking at biological evidence, something far harder to manipulate. But even DNA has limits. It can suggest, it can connect, but it cannot tell the full story. It cannot say with certainty, this is Sun Tzu, and that uncertainty matters. Because it keeps the line between fact and interpretation intact, which brings us to the most important point. This is not proof. Its possibility a strong one, a compelling one. But still, a theory built on patterns, parse that align, p-parse that makes sense, but patterns that cannot yet be confirmed completely, and maybe that's exactly how it would be. Because if there truly was a lineage built on strategy, on subtlety, on remaining unseen, then we wouldn't expect to find it easily. We wouldn't expect clear answers. We would find fragments, clues, connections that almost fit, never fully locked into place, just enough to suggest something bigger, but never enough to reveal it entirely. And that brings us back to the question that started it all. Who was Sun Tzu? A man, a myth, or a name representing something more? Because maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe it was never about identifying one individual. Maybe it was about recognizing a pattern, a continuity, a thread running through time. Because if Sun Tzu was part of a lineage, then his true legacy isn't just a book. It's a way of thinking, a framework. A method of understanding conflict, and control, and if that method was passed down, then it may not have ended. It may still exist, not as a visible force, not as a known institution, but as something quieter, embedded in people, in decisions, in strategies we don't even realize we're following. Because the most powerful ideas don't need recognition, they don't need credit. They just need to work. And the art of war has always worked, across cultures, across centuries, across completely different worlds, which raises one final question. If such a lineage existed once, what are the chances it truly disappeared? Because history shows us something again and again. Power rarely vanishes. It transforms, adapts new forms, and continues. Often in ways we don't immediately see. So maybe real story isn't about the past. Maybe it's about the present, because somewhere today, there are millions of people carrying fragments of this DNA, living ordinary lives, unaware, disconnected from ancient history, but still connected biologically. And within that, there's a possibility, a small one, but a real one, that the legacy of Sun Tzu, or whatever he truly was, has never actually ended. It simply changed form, just like the strategies he described, invisible, adaptable, always one step ahead. And if that's true, then the most important lesson of all isn't written in any book. It's hidden, in plain sight, waiting to be noticed, or perhaps carefully avoiding it. Because in the end, greatest victory is the one no one